What kind of little girl stands barefoot in the middle of a burning prairie road just to save her dying mother? Tonight, we bring you a powerful Western tale of cowboys, frontier love, motherhood, compassion, human dignity, and the courage ordinary people find when everyone else turns away. This story reminds us that mercy should never come with a price tag, and that one brave child can awaken the conscience of an entire valley. If this story touches your heart, please like, comment, share, subscribe, and stay with us until the very last line.
The prairie didn't care about a man's past. It only cared about heat, dirt, and how much sweat you were willing to pour into the cracked earth before you broke. Gideon Vance adjusted his grip on the leather reins. The summer sun was a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders, baking the brim of his Stetson. For 7 years, he kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, riding from town to town, territory to territory. He'd had turned in his deputy marshal badge in Billings on the day the earth took his wife, Rebecca. Since that winter night, he had lived by one unbreakable rule: never walk through a door that isn't yours to walk through. Mind your own business. Keep riding. But the prairie has a way of mocking a man's rules. His buckskin stallion, Ranger, caught a scent before Gideon saw a thing. Ranger was a seasoned horse with a lot of hard miles behind him and zero patience for surprises. The stallion planted all 4 hooves into the dry dirt, pulling up short as if he struck a stone wall. Gideon's hand moved by instinct. His fingers brushed the cold steel of the Winchester rifle scabbard. His eyes swept the shimmering trail ahead, searching the brush. Then he saw her. She was standing dead center in the middle of the wagon trail, not running, not hiding, just standing there, as if she had decided that whatever came down that road, she was going to stop it with nothing but her own small body. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her dress was the color of the grass in August bleached, thin and frayed at the hem. Gideon kept his hand on the rifle, but he didn't draw. He watched her eyes. They weren't wild or confused. They had that steady, heavy look people get when they run completely out of options and decided that the last one left, no matter how terrifying, is the only one they've got. You need to step aside, little miss, Gideon said. His voice came out rough, like gravel shifting in a pan. He hadn't used it much lately. Before you spook my horse. Your horse ain't spooked, the girl said. Gideon looked down. Ranger stood perfectly still, ears forward, watching the child with an attentive, calm curiosity. No, Gideon admitted, his grip relaxing slightly. He ain't. I need you to come with me, she said. Her chin came up. It was a practiced gesture, like she stood in the dirt and rehearsed those words 100 times until they sounded brave enough to say to a stranger. Please, I need you to come home with me. My mama is dying. Gideon looked past her. He looked down the empty trail. He looked at the flat, burning horizon stretching out in every direction, offering nothing but silence. How far? He asked. She pointed toward a thick stand of cottonwoods lining a dry creek bed. Not far, I can run fast. I didn't say I was coming. I know, she didn't budge an inch. But you're still here. Gideon sat with that for a second. The heat pushed down on his neck. Inside him, the old lawman ghost stirred, whispering that a child alone on a trail was a tragedy waiting to happen. What's your name? Knock, he asked. Ruthie, she said. Ruthie Sterling. How long has your mama been sick? Ruthie, 4 days. A tiny crack appeared in her practiced steadiness. Just a hairline fracture showing the terror underneath. She won't eat. She won't wake up all the way. She talks in her sleep, but it don't make sense. She keeps calling for my daddy. Ruthie swallowed hard. My daddy's been buried 2 years. Gideon was off his horse before his mind even gave the order. He tied Ranger's reins to a low branch and crouched down in the dust until his eyes were level with hers. Up close, the picture got worse. He saw the dried tear tracks in the dust on her cheeks. He saw the purple shadows of true exhaustion under her eyes. Then he looked at her feet. They were bare, covered in blisters that had broken, bled and dried without anyone to tend to them. Something hot and angry flared in Gideon's chest. "Is there no anyone else?" Gideon's voice softened, losing its rough edge. "No neighbors? Anyone in town you went to?" The look that crossed Ruthie's face wasn't sadness. It was older than sadness. It was the blank, hollow look of a child who had already learned what it felt like to be turned away. "I went to the Calder place first," she said, her voice flat as she reported the facts. "Mrs. Calder told me she couldn't get involved in war and business. Said it wasn't safe." Gideon's jaw tightened. "And then I walked to town." "How far is town?" 6 miles. 6 miles. 12 miles round trip, on bare, blistered feet." Gideon stared at the raw skin on her heels, his chest aching with a mixture of respect and fury. "I went to the doctor first," Ruthie continued, her voice trembling just a bit. "Dr. Briggs. He said he couldn't come out to a widow's ranch without payment up front, and we don't have no coin. He said he was sorry. Then I went to the sheriff. Sheriff Dawes said it wasn't his concern if a woman got sick on her own land. Then I walked back." "You walked 12 miles alone because they wouldn't help a Goafu." "I had to," she said simply. "There wasn't anyone else." Gideon stood up slowly, the joints in his knees popping. He looked back at the trail he had been riding, the road that promised him safety, isolation, and a quiet life where nobody asked anything of him. Then he looked at Ruthie. A doctor who valued gold over a beating heart, a sheriff who valued safety over his oath, a town full of folks who looked at a struggling mother and decided she didn't have a right to their time because she was alone. Gideon reached down and gently placed a hand on Ruthie's small shoulder, anchoring her. "A human soul's right to draw breath don't come with a price tag, kid," Gideon said, his voice deep and absolute. He looked toward the cottonwoods, the lawman in him fully awake now. "And those folks in town, they forgot what it means to be human. But I haven't." He unhitched Ranger's reins and looked down at the brave little girl. "Lead the way. Ruthie, we're going home." The cottonwoods didn't offer much shade. The leaves were dry, rattling in the hot wind like old paper. Ruthie walked fast for a child with bloody heels. She didn't complain. She didn't slow down. Gideon Vance walked beside his horse, keeping his pace slow enough for the girl but steady enough to keep the dust from settling over them. The Sterling homestead came into view through the gap in the trees. It was a modest place, a small square cabin built from rough-hewn pine logs, a leaning barn that looked like it was holding its breath against the next big storm, and a garden patch. The garden was losing its fight with the Montana sun. The tomato vines were yellowed, curling inward, begging for a drop of water that hadn't come. There was a stillness here that didn't feel right. No smoke from the chimney, no chickens scratching in the dirt. Just a gray cat sitting on top of a fence post, watching them with wide, unblinking eyes. "Mama's inside," Ruthie whispered. She stopped 10 yards from the porch, her small body suddenly trembling. The bravery she'd worn on the trail was wearing thin. "You did good, kid," Gideon said softly. He reached out, his large hand resting on the crown of her head for a brief second. "You brought help. Stay here with Ranger. Let him have a drink from that bucket by the pump." Gideon stepped onto the porch. The floorboards groaned under his boots. He placed his hand on the iron latch of the door, paused, and listened. Nothing, just the heavy, dragging sound of shallow breathing from the dark interior. He pushed the door open. The heat inside hit him like a physical blow. It was trapped air, thick with the smell of old copper, sweat, and the sharp, sour tang of a body burning from the inside out. The cabin was dark, the single window blocked by a heavy wooden shutter. Gideon pulled his hat off and let his eyes adjust. The cabin was clean. That was the first thing that struck him. Despite the poverty, despite the empty shelves, someone had cared for this room. The pine floor was swept. A stack of school books sat on a small crate near the corner. A hand-stitched sampler hung on the wall, reading, "The Lord is my shepherd." But the iron stove was cold, and the tin larder on the counter was propped open, showing nothing but a dusting of white flour at the bottom. In the corner, on a narrow iron cot, lay Clara Sterling. She looked small under the thin wool blanket, Her skin was the color of old milk, except for her cheeks, which burned with a furious, deep crimson flush. Her dark hair was damp, matted against her forehead. Her hands were resting on her chest, her fingers curled inward like wild petals closing before a hard frost. Gideon crossed the room in 3 long strides. He knelt by the cot and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. The heat made him draw his hand back by instinct. It wasn't a mild ailment. This was the deep, baking fire of a body fighting for its life. Her breathing was ragged, catching in her throat every few seconds. "Mrs. Sterling," Gideon said, keeping his voice low but firm. "Clara, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. They were heavy, swollen. She didn't open them all the way, just enough for Gideon to see a sliver of clouded green eyes. She groaned, a small, desperate sound, and turned her head away from him. "James," she muttered, her voice barely a breath. "The fence. Don't let them take the creek." She was drifting in the past. Gideon stood up and looked around the room. He was a man who had buried his own life 7 years ago, a man who had sworn never to get tangled up in the miseries of strangers. Yet here he was, in a dying woman's cabin, and his boots felt like they were anchored to the floorboards. He walked back to the door and pushed it wide, letting the fresh air cut through the stagnation. "Ruthie," he called out. The girl appeared at the threshold, her eyes wide with terror. Is she gone?" "No," Gideon said, and he made sure his voice sounded like a rock she could lean on. "She's fighting, and we're going to give her a hand. I need water. Ruthie, cold water. Every bucket you've got." "There's a barrel in the barn," the girl said, her voice rising with sudden hope. "An old pickle barrel. It holds a lot. Go get it. Roll it to the pump. Fill it as high as you can manage. Then bring it to the door. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." She turned and ran toward the barn, her blistered feet forgotten in the rush of purpose. Gideon turned back to the Goa-foot. He found an old cedar chest at the foot of the bed. He opened it, finding 2 clean sheets and a few worn towels. He took a tin basin from the stove, walked out to the well pump, and drew a bucket of cold water. Back inside, he sat on a low wooden stool beside Clara's cot. He dipped a towel into the cold water, wrung it out until it was just damp, and laid it gently across her burning forehead. Clara flinched, her body shivering at the sudden shock of cold. She made a soft, whimpering sound, but her breathing slowed slightly. Gideon didn't look away. He took a clean pewter spoon from the shelf and filled a tin cup with fresh water. He placed his large arm under her shoulders, lifting her head with a gentleness that didn't belong to a man who spent his life handling iron and leather. "Drink, Clara," he murmured, pressing the rim of the cup to her cracked lips. "Just a sip. Your body needs the moisture to fight the fire. Take it slow." She swallowed by instinct. A little water spilled down her chin, cutting a clean line through the dried sweat. But she managed to take 3 small sips before her head grew too heavy and she sank back into the pillow. Gideon wrung the towel out again, dipped it back into the basin, and replaced it on her brow. He kept up the rhythm. Minutes bled into an hour. The sun shifted outside, casting long, golden bars of light through the open door, painting the pine floorboards with the color of old honey. He changed the cloths every 3 minutes, never letting the heat settle back into her skin. He gave her water a spoonful at a time, watching her throat move, measuring her strength by the steadiness of her swallow. Outside, he heard the heavy, scraping sound of the pickle barrel being rolled across the dirt. Ruthie came through the door, her face red, her breath coming in short, gasping pants. She was throwing her whole 8-year-old weight against the heavy wooden barrel, her small hands dark with grease and dust. Gideon stood up, caught the lip of the barrel, and slid it into the corner near the bed. It was 3/4 full of clear, cold well water. "You did a man's work just now." "Ruthie," Gideon said, looking down at her. The girl wiped her nose with the back of her sleeve, her chin lifting. "Mama says work don't care about the size of the hands doing it. It only cares if the job gets done." Gideon stared at her. The words hit him somewhere deep, somewhere he kept locked up since Billings. Your mama is a wise woman. He sat back down on the stool. He took a thin wool blanket, dipped the corner of it into the cold water of the barrel, and draped the wet cloth over Clara's legs, helping the heat escape from her limbs. Clara's eyes fluttered again. This time, they stayed open a little longer. The clouded look was still there, but she saw him. She saw the heavy shoulders, the trail-worn shirt, the dark beard. Panic flared in her chest. She tried to pull away, her hand reaching blindly toward the wall behind the bed. "Mama," Ruthie cried, rushing to the side of the cot, grabbing her mother's hand. "It's okay." He stopped. He hissed the cowboy from the trail. He stayed to help. Clara looked from her daughter to Gideon. Her gaze was flat, unreadable, the look of a woman who had been disappointed too many times by the world to trust a stranger with a rifle. "Why?" she whispered. Her voice was like dry leaves scraping over stone. "Why would you stop for us?" Gideon met her green eyes steadily. He didn't blink. He didn't soften his gaze. "Because your daughter stood in the middle of a hot trail on bleeding feet and asked me to," Gideon said, his voice dropping into a low, quiet resonance. "And because a human soul in trouble don't need a license or a bank account to deserve a helping hand." Ma'am Clara stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for a lie, for an angle, for the hidden price tag that always seemed to come with a stranger's kindness. But she found nothing but the hard, honest gravity of a man who spoke the truth because he didn't know how to speak anything else. Her tension bled out. Her eyes closed, and she drifted back into the sleep of exhaustion. But her breathing was smoother now. The rhythm was changing. The fire was still burning, but the walls of her house were holding. Gideon stood up and walked to the door, looking out at the fading light. The shadows of the cottonwoods were stretching long across the valley. The sky was turning the color of a bruised plum. "Ruthie," he said, not turning around. "Yes, sir, go find some dry kindling in the barn. We're going to need a small fire to boil some cornmeal when the night air turns cold. Your mama's going to be hungry when she wakes up tomorrow. We don't have much cornmeal left," Ruthie said quietly, her voice dropping. "Just a little tin on the shelf." Gideon reached into his saddlebag, which he'd brought inside, and pulled out a heavy sack of dried beef and a small pouch of salt. "We've got enough," Gideon said. "A human being don't need a feast to survive. Knock. We just need enough to keep the boots moving forward. Go get that wood." As the girl hurried out, Gideon leaned against the doorframe. For 7 years, he'd been running from the world, thinking that by avoiding other people's pain, he was protecting his own. But looking at the quiet cabin, at the small girl working in the fading light, he realized a hard truth. He hadn't been living. He'd just been hiding in the saddle, and the road was a poor excuse for a home. The dawn came up cold and gray, the way it always did before the Montana sun burned the moisture out of the air. Gideon Vance hadn't slept. He'd spent the night in the wooden chair by the door, his Winchester resting across his lap, his ears tuned to the sounds of the prairie. Around 3 in the morning, Clara's breathing had finally broken its ragged edge. The heat had left her skin, replaced by the cool, clean sweat of a fever that had lost its grip. When the first gray light filtered through the wooden shutter, she was sleeping deeply, her face soft and still for the first time in days. Gideon stood up, his joints protesting the long night of vigilance. He walked outside, breathed in the sharp, pine-scented air, and checked on Ranger. The buckskin stallion gave a soft whinny, nudging Gideon's shoulder with his nose. "Good boy," Gideon murmured, patting the horse's neck. "We're staying a bit longer." Ruthie was already awake, sitting on the porch steps with her knees pulled up to her chest. Her bare feet were dirty, the blisters from her 12-mile walk covered in dried gray mud she'd applied to keep the flies away. "Is she better?" the girl asked, her eyes searching his face. "The fever broke," Gideon said. "She's resting now. Real rest. The kind that heals." Ruthie let out a breath, her shoulders dropping an inch. Gideon looked past her toward the north side of the property. The fence line ran along a ridge of dry grass, but even from the porch, he could see the problems. Two of the pine posts were leaning at a sharp angle, the rusted barbed wire sagging into the dirt like a broken spider web. "Your fence is down," Gideon observed. "The north pasture," Ruthie said, turning her head to look. "My daddy built that fence before I was born. He used to walk the line every spring to check for soft wood and broken wire. He taught me how to do it, too." Gideon looked down at her. "He taught you?" "Yes, sir. He said a rancher's word is only as good as his fence line. If you can't keep your boundaries straight, you don't own nothing but dirt and trouble." She paused, her small face darkening. "I tried to fix it after he died, but the mallet's too heavy. I can't lift it high enough to drive the stakes. I know where all the bad spots are, though I keep a map of them in my head." Gideon walked to the barn and found the tools: an old post mallet with a split ash handle, a coil of rusted wire, and a pair of iron pliers. The tools were worn, greasy with old sweat, but they were solid. He walked back to the porch and held the mallet out toward the girl. "Come on, then. Knox, show me your map." Ruthie jumped off the porch, her bare feet hitting the dirt with a light patter. She led him down the north line, walking with a strange, purposeful stride that looked exactly like an old rancher inspecting his domain. "There," she said, stopping about 30 yards from the house. She pointed to a section where two posts had rotted through at the base, the wood gray and spongy from years of winter snow. "That's the worst one. The cattle from the Calder place used to drift through here before they sold them off." Gideon set the tools down. He took a new pine stake he'd found in the barn, set the point against the hard, dry earth, and lifted the heavy iron mallet above his head. His muscles bunched under his shirt. Thud. The sound carried through the quiet valley, sharp and clean. Thud, thud. Ruthie sat on the top rail of a good section nearby, her legs swinging, watching him work with an intense, quiet focus. She didn't speak. She didn't ask questions. She just watched the way he swung the mallet, the way he used his legs for leverage, the way he twisted the wire with the pliers to get the tension just right. "You rememorizing this?" Gideon said, not breaking his rhythm as he drove the second post into the dirt. "Yes, sir," she said simply. "In case you leave. In case I have to do it myself next time." Gideon stopped his swing. He lowered the mallet and looked at her, an 8-year-old girl, already calculating the day she'd be left alone again, already preparing to carry a grown man's burden because the world had shown her no mercy. He leaned against the post, his chest rising and falling with his breath. "A child shouldn't have to look at the world that way, Ruthie," Gideon said, his voice dropping into that quiet, gravelly weight. "You were supposed to be thinking about school books and playing in the creek, not how to splice rusted wire on a boundary line." "Mama says the land don't care how old you are," Ruthie replied, her voice steady. "It just demands what it demands. If we don't work it, Barrett Thorne takes it. That's what he told Mama." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "Barrett Thorne, the big man from town," she said. "He came in March with 2 riders. They had big hats and silver spurs, and their horses looked expensive. He stood right in our kitchen and told Mama that Daddy owed him money before he died. Said there was a note against the land. He had papers with him, too." "Did your Mama see the papers?" "She looked at them, but she don't know much about court writing." It made her real scared. After that, she started looking small. She stopped sleeping. That's when the sickness took her, I think. The worry just burned her out." Gideon picked up the pliers and went back to the wire. His movements were sharper now, fueled by a cold, familiar anger. He knew the type. Barrett Thorne was a land speculator, a parasite that fed on the grief of widows and the isolation of small homesteads. They'd wait until a man died, then swoop in with forged signatures and a pair of hired guns, betting that a lonely woman wouldn't have the stomach or the money to fight them in a territory court. "Your daddy didn't owe him a dime," Gideon said, his teeth clenched as he pulled the wire taut. "How do you know?" "Because men like Thorne don't use the law when they in the right, kid. They use fear. Fear is the weapon of a coward who knows his foundation is built on sand." He finished the knot, snipping the excess wire with a sharp clink of the pliers. He stood up and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. Suddenly, Ranger let out a sharp, short snort from the yard down by the cabin. Gideon's body went completely still. His old martial training didn't rust. It just waited in the dark. He didn't turn his head fast. He just shifted his eyes toward the eastern ridge, where a thin line of pine trees bordered the Sterling property. Two riders were sitting their horses just inside the tree line. They weren't moving. They were just watching. One was a tall man in a dark duster coat. The other was broader, sitting on a heavy bay horse. The sun caught the glint of a rifle scabbard on the bay's saddle. They were too far away for Gideon to see their faces, but he didn't need to. He knew the posture of hired muscle. They were surveying the ranch, noting the new fence posts, noting the buckskin horse in the yard. "Gideon," Ruthie whispered, her voice suddenly dropping into a scared tremor. "Who is that?" Gideon reached down and caught her by the arm, lifting her off the rail until her feet touched the dirt behind his body, using his own broad shoulders to shield her from their line of sight. "Go inside, Ruthie," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "Go sit by your mama. Don't look back at the ridge." "Are they going to shoot?" "No," Gideon said, his hand dropping to the Winchester scabbard he'd carried up the hill with him. "They re's buying information today. They re trying to see if the widow is still alone. Go on now. Move." The girl didn't argue. She turned and ran low across the grass, her small body disappearing into the darkness of the cabin door. Gideon stayed exactly where he was. He didn't draw his rifle. He just stood by the new, solid fence post, his boots planted firmly in the dry dirt, his hand resting on the iron pliers. He stared straight at the tree line, letting the two riders see him, letting them see the size of his shoulders, letting them see that the rules of the Sterling homestead had changed overnight. The two riders sat there for another minute, their horses shifting in the brush. Then the tall one pulled his reins, turning his horse back into the deep shadow of the pines. The second one followed. The sound of their retreat was swallowed by the wind through the valley. Gideon didn't move for a long time. The wind picked up, swirling the dust around his boots. He looked down at the new fence line he just built. It was straight. It was tight. But a fence was only a boundary. It wasn't a fortress. Barrett Thorne knew someone was here now. The low-pressure approach was over. The real fight was coming down the road, and it wasn't going to be settled with cold cloths and water. Gideon turned and walked back toward the cabin, his jaw set, the old deputy marshal badge feeling like a heavy, cold weight against his phantom chest. He spent 7 years running from the law, running from the world, thinking that isolation was the only way to keep from losing anything else. But as he looked at the open door of the cabin, he knew he was done riding past. A human being had to stand somewhere. And this dirt was as good a place as any. The interior of the cabin felt different by midday. The sour smell of the sickness was mostly gone, replaced by the clean scent of wood smoke and the faint, earthy aroma of boiled cornmeal. Clara Sterling was sitting up. She was propped against a couple of feather pillows, her skin still pale, but her green eyes were clear. The clouded look of the fever had vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp focus that told Gideon everything he needed to know about her spirit. Ruthie sat at the foot of the cot, her fingers wrapped around the gray cat's fur. She hadn't left her mother's side since the riders on the ridge had disappeared. Gideon stood by the wooden table, his hat in his hand. He didn't crowd her space. A man who has spent years in enforcement knows that when a person is recovering from a trauma, you give them room to breathe. You don't take up the whole doorway. You let them feel like they own the air around them. "You look better, Mrs. Sterling," Gideon said. His voice was a low rumble, keeping the rhythm steady. "I feel like I've been dragged through a rock pile." "Mr. Vance," Clara said. Her voice was thin, but her words were crisp. She looked at his trail-worn shirt, then at the rifle leaning against the wall. "Ruthie told me what you did. The water, the fence, the watchers on the ridge. I did what needed doing." Gideon said, "Nothing more. People don't just do what needs doing in these parts." Clara said, her lips tightening into a hard, straight line. Not without a price tag. Not for a go of foo. Gideon didn't flinch. He walked over to the stool by the bed and sat down, dropping his height so he wasn't looking down at her. I don't sell my time, ma'am, and I don't collect debts from folks who are already paying the price for the cowardice of their neighbors. Your daughter walked 12 miles on bleeding heels because a whole town decided it wasn't safe to look after a child. I'm just balancing the ledger a bit. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She was searching his face, looking for the catch. When she found nothing but the flat, honest truth, her shoulders dropped an inch. She turned her head toward the small shelf between the larder and the window. "Ruthie," Clara said softly, "bring me the book." The girl slid off of the bed, her bare feet making a light pat-pat against the pine floorboards. She reached up to the high shelf and pulled down a heavy, leather-bound family Bible. The corners were scuffed, the leather dark from years of oil from working hands. She brought it to her mother, handling it with a quiet reverence. Clara didn't open the pages to read. Instead, she pressed her thumb against the inside of the thick back cover. There was a faint click, the sound of a hidden seam parting. The leather back was a false pocket, constructed by a man who knew how to keep a secret safe. She pulled out a small packet of folded documents, wrapped in a piece of oiled silk to keep the moisture out. She held them out toward Gideon. Gideon didn't reach for them immediately. He waited until she nodded, granting him the right to touch her property. That a lesson he'd learned a long time ago. An individual's privacy is their castle, especially when they've been stripped of everything else. You don't just grab. You ask. He unfolded the silk wrapper. Inside were 3 documents: a land deed, a territorial survey record, and a registered filing receipt from the land office in Helena. Gideon spread them out on the wooden table. He picked up his reading glasses from his waistcoat pocket, slid them onto his nose, and went to work. He was a man who knew the language of the law. He knew the difference between a legitimate stamp and a forged ink block. He knew the weight of legal paper. He read each line twice. He checked the registration numbers. He checked the dates. The documents were flawless. James Sterling had purchased this quarter section 9 years ago. He paid off the initial land grant in full before he ever drove the first fence post. The deed was signed, witnessed by 2 county officials, and entered into the territory books in Helena. There was no lien. There was no mortgage. There was no outstanding debt against this soil of any kind. Gideon took off his glasses and folded the papers back into the silk wrapper. He looked at Clara. "Barrett Thorne lied to you, Mrs. Sterling," Gideon said, his voice flat, dropping into that dangerous, quiet register. "He lied from the second he stepped through your door." Clara's hand trembled slightly against the blanket. "He had papers, Mr. Vance. They looked real. They had a seal on them. He said James signed a promissory note 3 months before he passed. Said he borrowed $500 to buy seed and tools. James Sterling didn't borrow a dime," Gideon said. "I spent 15 years looking at fraudulent land claims. Ma'am, a man who borrows $500 don't keep a clean registration ledger in Helena. Thorne's papers are trash. He created a debt out of thin air because he knew you were alone. And he knew your neighbors were too terrified of his name to stand up and call him a thief. The Calders knew," Ruthie said from the corner, her voice small but sharp. "Mrs. Calder looked at my feet and told me it wasn't safe to get involved. She knew Mr. Thorne was lying. Maybe she did," Knock, Gideon said, turning his eyes to the girl. "Or maybe she was just letting her fear make her decisions for her. Fear is a funny thing. It makes a person look at an injustice, look at a child in pain, and pretend they don't see a thing just so they can sleep easy for one more night. But it don't work. A man who trades his honor for safety ends up with neither." Clara sat up straighter, her jaw setting into that hard, pioneer mold. "James always said the land was the only thing that couldn't be taken from us if the paperwork was right. He spent 2 years working extra shifts at the timber mill just to file that deed clean. He knew he was getting sick. He did it for us. And he did it right," Gideon said, tapping the silk wrapper. "This paperwork is an iron wall. Mrs. Sterling, Thorne can't touch you in a legitimate court of law. His whole claim falls apart the second a judge looks at these registration numbers. "But we aren't in Helena," Clara said, her green eyes narrowing as she looked out the window toward the dry ridge. "We out here. And Barrett Thorne don't use courtrooms when he can use a midnight rider and a box of matches. The law don't mean much when your barn is burning." Gideon stood up, his tall frame blocking the bar of sunlight from the door. He walked over to the rifle, leaning against the logs, and picked it up, checking the lever mechanism with a smooth, practiced click. "The law matters, ma'am," Gideon said, his voice dropping low, steady as a heartbeat. "It matters because it's the only thing that separates us from the beasts in the woods. It gives the honest person a right to stand their ground. Thorne thinks he owns this valley because nobody's forced him to look at the rules yet. He thinks his wealth gives him the right to rewrite the truth." He pulled his Stetson down low over his eyes. "I'm going to make sure he reads the rules, Mrs. Sterling. Every single line." Clara looked at him, her face tight with a mixture of fear and something new, something that looked like the return of hope. "He won't take a refusal lightly, Mr. Vance." "Good," Gideon said, walking toward the threshold. "I don't give them lightly either. Ruthie, stay with your mama. Keep the door barred until I get back. I am going to have a chat with our neighbor." The night came down fast, swallowing the heat of the day and replacing it with the sharp, biting chill of the high plains. Gideon Vance didn't sit inside the cabin. He sat out on the porch steps, his back pressed against the rough logs, his Winchester lying flat across his knees. The valley was silent. This only sound was the steady, rhythmic chirping of the crickets in the dry grass and the occasional, lonely wail of a coyote out on the eastern flats. Inside, the lantern had been extinguished hours ago. Clara and Ruthie were asleep, their safety secured behind 4 inches of solid pine in a heavy oak bar. Gideon had spent his afternoon at the Calder place. He hadn't drawn a gun. He just stood in Ed Calder's yard and forced the big rancher to look at the raw skin on Ruthie's feet, using words like a whip until Calder had looked down at the dirt in shame. Gideon hadn't asked him to fight. He just asked him to watch. A neighbor who won't keep watch is just a squatter on his own conscience. Gideon had told him. Calder had promised to keep his eyes on the road. Now the midnight air shifted. Ranger gave a low, barely audible snort from his corral near the barn. His ears went flat against his skull. Gideon's body went rigid. He didn't move a muscle, didn't even lift his head, but his eyes slid toward the eastern approach. Through the thin, silver moonlight, he saw them. 4 riders. They were coming slow, their horses walking in the soft dirt beside the trail to muffle the sound of their hooves. They didn't have lanterns lit, but as they cleared the stand of cottonwoods, the lead rider reached down and struck a match against his saddle horn. A small yellow flare erupted in the dark. The rider brought it to the tip of a thick, oil-soaked burlap torch. The fire caught instantly, roaring into a furious, dancing orange flame that cast long, monstrous shadows across the dirt yard. The riders split up by instinct, 2 angling toward the leaning barn, 2 coming straight for the porch where Gideon sat in the dark. Gideon didn't shout a warning. He didn't give them the benefit of a surprise. He lifted the Winchester, leveled it at the sky, and squeezed the trigger. Bang! The report split the midnight silence like a lightning strike through dry timber. The lead rider's horse reared back, its front hooves flailing in the dirt, throwing the torchlight into a wild, chaotic spin. The 2 riders heading for the barn pulled up hard, their mounts spinning in panic. Gideon stepped off the porch, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy, solid thud. He moved forward until he was standing directly between the burning torch and the cabin door. He chambered a fresh round with a sharp, metallic clack-clack that carried perfectly through the sudden silence. "That's close enough," Gideon said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the weight of an executioner's axe. "The next one don't go into the sky." The lead rider managed to settle his horse. He was a young man, maybe 25, with a thin mustache and the nervous, shifting eyes of a boy who had been told this was an empty ranch. He held the blazing torch high, his face slick with sweat despite the midnight chill. The big man Gideon had seen on the road wasn't here. Thorn had sent his second-string muscle to do his dirty work. "You're trespassing, mister," the young rider shouted, trying to put some steel into his voice and failing. "This land belongs to Barrett Thorn. The widow's time is up. We got orders to clear the improvements. You're standing on deeded, registered ground," Gideon said, his rifle resting easy against his shoulder, pointed straight at the young man's breastbone. "The title belongs to the Sterling family. You throw that torch, son, and you recommitting arson on legal property in front of a former federal officer. Think real hard about whether Barrett Thorn is going to pay your legal fees in Helena when this goes sideways." The young man looked at the torch in his hand, then at the dark bore of Gideon's Winchester. He swallowed hard. The two riders by the barn hadn't moved an inch. They were waiting to see if their leader was willing to die for another man's land grab. Suddenly, the cabin door creaked open behind Gideon. He didn't turn his head. You never take your eyes off the target, but his ears caught the sound of a heavy mechanism. Clara Sterling stepped out onto the porch boards. She was wrapped in her wool shawl, her face pale in the moonlight, but her hands were perfectly steady. She was holding her late husband's 12-gauge shotgun, both hammers pulled back with a twin. Ominous click-click. "This is my ground," Clara said, her voice cutting through the dark like a razor. "My husband broke this dirt. My daughter was born in that room. I buried James less than a mile from where you're standing, and I am not moving for a thief." Silence settled back over the yard. The torch crackled, a drop of burning oil sizzling as it hit the dirt. Gideon didn't lower his rifle, but a faint, cold smile touched his lips. "You heard the lady. Boys," he said softly, "this is the only offer on the table tonight. Drop the torch, turn your horses around, and ride back to Thorn. Tell him his scare tactics don't work on people who know their rights." The lead rider looked at Clara, then at Gideon, his mathematical calculation completely falling apart. He'd been told he was coming to frighten a sick woman and a child. Instead, he was looking down the barrels of a Winchester and a double-barreled shotgun held by two people who looked like they'd welcome the fight. He didn't make a speech. He just flipped his wrist, tossing the blazing torch into the dirt at his horse's hooves, where it sputtered and smoked in the dust. He yanked his horse head around and dug his spurs into its flanks. The other three followed him, their horses throwing up a cloud of gray dirt as they galloped back toward the cottonwoods, the sound of their retreat fading into the vast, empty night until there was nothing left but the wind. Gideon walked over to the smoldering torch and stamped it into the dirt with his boot heel until the last orange spark was dead. He exhaled slow, letting the adrenaline drain out of his arms. He turned around and looked up at the porch. Clara was still standing there, the shotgun resting against her apron, her spine straight as an iron rod. "I told you to stay inside, Mrs. Sterling," Gideon said, leaning his rifle against his leg. "I heard you the first time." "Mr. Vance," she said, her green eyes reflecting the moonlight. "But like I told you before, I'm done hiding inside while men with torches decide what's mine. A person's got a right to stand on their own porch and look their enemy in the eye." Gideon walked up the steps and stood beside her. He looked down at her small hands, which were still resting on the walnut stock of the shotgun. They weren't shaking, not a bit. "Your husband taught you well," Gideon said. "He taught me how to shoot," Clara whispered, looking out at the empty trail. "But he didn't teach me how to stop being afraid. I had to find that myself. Just now, that's the secret." "Ma'am," Gideon said, his voice softening into a human cadence, "the fear don't ever fully go away. You just decide that the thing you re-protecting your home, your child, your right to be treated with respect is bigger than the fear. Once you make that choice, the other side loses their power over you." Clara looked up at him, her face close enough for him to see the silver trail of a single tear she hadn't let fall. "They'll be back, won't they?" "Yes," Gideon said honestly. "Thorn sent the boys tonight to see if the door would push open easy. Now he knows it won't. He's going to have to come himself next time, or send someone who don't mind a gunfight." He picked up his Winchester. "We out of time for a local lawyer. Clara, I need to ride to Helena myself. I need to put that deed in front of Judge Morrison before Thorn realizes his muscle didn't do the job. That's a 2-day ride, Clara said, her breath catching. I can do it in a day and a half if I push Ranger. Gideon said, while I am gone, I want you to take those papers out of the Bible. Hide them in the barn, under the hay. Somewhere a man wouldn't think to look if he came kicking through the house. And don't worry about the ridge. Ed Calder will be watching. Clara looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face one last time. The suspicion was completely gone now, replaced by an openness that made Gideon's chest feel tight. Be careful, Gideon, she said softly. It was the first time she'd used his Christian name. Not just because of the ranch. Just be careful. I will, Gideon said. He turned toward the corral to check his cinch. The first hint of dawn was breaking over the eastern flats, a thin gray line that promised a long, hard road ahead. But for the first time in 7 years, Gideon Vance didn't feel like a man who was running away. He felt like a man who was finally going home. The road to the Calder Ranch was short, but it felt long in the first gray light of the morning. The air was sharp, biting at Gideon's cheeks. Ranger's hooves made a steady, rhythmic plop-plop in the damp dirt of the trail. Gideon didn't push the stallion yet. He saved the horse's strength for the long miles ahead, the hard miles that led over the mountain ridge toward Helena. He pulled up in Ed Calder's yard just as the kitchen chimney started to spit thin white smoke. The Calder place was bigger than the Sterling homestead. It had a double-pane barn, a sturdy bunkhouse, and 4 fat milk cows chewing the dry grass in the corral. It was the ranch of a man who was doing well, a man who had successfully stayed out of the line of fire. Gideon didn't dismount. He sat easy in his leather saddle, his Winchester resting across his thigh, waiting. A man don't go barging onto another man's porch at dawn without invitation. It's an unwritten rule of the frontier. You give a person their space. You let them choose to face you. The heavy oak door swung open. Ed Calder stepped out onto the planks. He was wearing his canvas work trousers and a wool shirt, his suspenders hanging loose at his hips. He was a big man, wide through the shoulders, but the years of outdoor labor had started to bow his spine. His face was weathered, graying at the temples, and his eyes were wary. He looked at Gideon, then at the buckskin stallion, then down the trail toward the Sterling cabin. I heard a shot last night. Vance, Calder said. His voice was thick with sleep and tension. 2 hours past midnight. 1 shot, Gideon said. His voice carried clearly through the crisp air. A warning. Barrett Thorne sent 4 riders with an oil torch. They wanted to burn the widow's barn down while she slept. Calder's jaw worked. He looked down at his own boots, his hand tightening around the cedar porch railing. My wife, she don't want no trouble. Vance Thorne's got a long reach. He's got the county sheriff in his pocket. A man's got to look out for his own roof first. Gideon slung his leg over the saddle horn and slid down to the dirt, his boots hitting the ground with a solid, deliberate thud. He didn't draw a weapon. He just walked over to the well pump in the center of the yard, picked up the tin cup sitting on the wooden lid, and drew a splash of cold water. He took a slow sip, letting the rhythm of the morning settle between them. Take a look at your hands, Ed, Gideon said softly. Calder blinked, looking down at his large, calloused palms. What about 'em? They read the hands of an honest laborer, Gideon said, pointing with the tin cup. You broke this valley with those fingers. You built that double-pen barn with your own muscle. You're a man who understands what it takes to turn wild dirt into a home. Gideon set the cup down with a sharp clink. But those hands don't mean a lick if they shake when a bully walks into the room. Gideon continued, his voice dropping into that low, gravelly register. You think you rebuying safety by closing your doors to a crying child. You think because your roof is solid today, Thorne won't decide he wants your water rights tomorrow. An injury done to one person's right is a threat to every man's liberty. Ed, when you let a thief steal your neighbor's ground, you were just helping him sharpen the spade he's going to use to dig your own grave. Calder's face flushed a deep, dark red. He took a step forward, his chest swelling. You got no right to lecture me on my own timber. Vance lived in this valley 6 years. I've minded my own business. And your business includes the folks around you, Gideon said, stepping closer until he was looking straight into the older man's eyes. Ruthie Sterling walked 12 miles on bare, bleeding skin because nobody in this valley had the courage to tell a liar no. She's 8 years old, Ed. Her father used to trade seed with you every spring in this very yard. Now he's under the dirt, and his little girl is carrying a grown man's burden alone. Gideon reached out and placed a heavy hand on Calder's shoulder. He didn't squeeze. He just left it there. A solid weight. An appeal from one human being to another. I am riding to Helena, Gideon said. I'm taking Clara's original deed to Judge Morrison. I need a day and a half to get there, and a day and a half to get back. I'm not asking you to pick up a rifle and go to war, Ed. I'm asking you to watch. You see trouble at the Sterling place. You take your wagon down there and you stand on that porch. Let Thorne's boys see that the widow ain't isolated anymore. Can you do that much for the memory of James Sterling? Calder stared at Gideon's hand on his shoulder. He looked out toward the horizon, where the sun was finally clearing the hills, throwing long, golden lines across the dry prairie grass. The silence stretched between them until the only sound was the crackle of the kitchen fire inside the house. Calder let out a long, ragged sigh. His broad shoulders sagged, the anger draining out of him, replaced by something older, something decent. Yeah, Calder said quietly. He lifted his head, his eyes meeting Gideon's without the wariness now. I can do that. Vance will harness the team after breakfast. My wife, she can say what she likes. But James was a good man. I won't let his girl get burned out. That's all a man can do. Ed, Gideon said, releasing his shoulder. We look after each other, or we ain't nothing but animals fighting over meat in the dark. Thank you. Gideon walked back to Ranger, swung up into the saddle with a smooth, practiced motion, and turned the buckskin's head toward the northern trail. He gave Calder a short nod, dug his spurs lightly into the horse's flanks, and broke into a steady, swinging trot. The road to Helena was long, but as the wind caught the brim of his Stetson, Gideon felt a cold clarity settle into his ribs. The valley was waking up. The wall of fear was beginning to crack. The county seat of Oakhaven wasn't much more than a single, wide dirt street lined with false-fronted frame buildings and hitching rails. It smelled of horse manure, stale beer, and the bitter dust that blew off the southern flats. Gideon Vance rode in around noon, his shirt gray with trail grit, his eyes narrowed against the glaring sun. He tied Ranger to the rail outside a modest clapboard building with a painted shingle that read, Samuel Tucker, Attorney at Law. Through the glass window, Gideon could see 2 desks. At the front desk sat a young man with sandy hair, wearing a starched white collar and a wool waistcoat that looked too hot for a Montana summer. He was sharpening a lead pencil with a pocket knife, his eyes alert, tracking every movement on the street. Gideon pushed the door open. A small brass bell chimed overhead. The sandy-haired clerk looked up instantly, his face sliding into a smooth, professional smirk that didn't reach his eyes. Can I help you? Sir, Mr. Tucker is occupied with a client at the moment. My name is Gideon Vance, Gideon said, his boots clicking loud against the clean floorboards as he walked straight to the railing that divided the room. Tell Tucker Wom here about the Sterling land claim. Tell him it's a matter of federal fraud, and I ain't got time to wait on the porch. Gideon watched the young man's eyes. At the name Sterling, a tiny fracture-thin tremor passed through the clerk's eyelids. It was gone in a flash, replaced by that smooth, blank mask. But Gideon caught it. He'd spent 15 years reading faces across interrogation tables. He knew a guilty twitch when he saw one. This was Peters, Barrett Thorne's nephew. The fox was sitting right inside the henhouse. As I said, Mr. Vance, the attorney is busy, Peters began, rising from his chair. The inner door opened before the clerk could finish his sentence. A compact man in his mid-50s stepped out. He had silver at his temples, a sharp hawk-like nose, and the tired, calculating eyes of a man who had spent 20 years reading land deeds and criminal indictments. He looked at Gideon's dusty duster, noted the position of the Winchester scabbard visible through the open door, and nodded once. I am Samuel Tucker, the lawyer said. Come on in, Mr. Vance. Peters, fetch us some coffee from the hotel. Gideon followed Tucker into the back office. The room was lined with heavy, leather-bound law ledgers and tin filing boxes. Tucker closed the door firmly, clicked the iron latch, and sat behind a large mahogany desk. He didn't offer a handshake. He just pointed to a leather chair across from him. "You brought something from Clara Sterling, didn't you?" Tucker asked, his voice low, his eyes fixed on Gideon's coat pocket. Gideon reached into his duster and pulled out the silk wrapper, sliding it onto the polished wood between them. The original deed, the survey record, the filing receipt from Helena. James Sterling paid the territory in full 9 years ago. There is no debt. There never was. Tucker picked up the documents with careful, steady fingers. He adjusted his spectacles and read through the pages, his breath coming even and slow. He didn't look surprised. His face just grew harder, the lines around his mouth deepening until he looked like he was carved out of granite. He laid the papers down and looked at Gideon. "This is the piece I've been waiting for," Tucker whispered. He opened his deep desk drawer and pulled out a thick, legal-sized leather folio, placing it right next to the Sterling wrapper. "Take a look at that." Vance, Gideon leaned forward, flipping open the folio. Inside were notes, names and property descriptions for 6 other families in the valley. The Hesters, the Brennans, 4 others. Every single one of them had a detailed history of visits from Barrett Thorne and his riders, fabricated promissory notes, forged signatures, threats of arson and violence. 6 families, Gideon muttered, his eyes skimming the details. Thorne isn't just stealing a ranch. He's building an empire out of paper and blood. He's using a system. "Vance," Tucker said, leaning over the desk. "He bought Sheriff Dawes 6 months ago. He put his nephew, Peters, in my outer office 8 months ago to watch my mail and see who comes to complain. Every time a homesteader tries to fight, Thorne knows about it before the ink is dry on the petition. The families either sell for pennies under pressure, or they hold on until they break. The law don't work when the officers are the ones holding the bag." "Tucker," Gideon said, his voice dropping low. "That's where you're wrong, my friend," Tucker said, his gray eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce light. "The law is an instrument. It's a tool. If the local handle is broken, you don't throw the tool away, you carry it to a higher bench. I've been building this file for 4 months, but I didn't have a single clean, unimpeachable title to prove the forgery beyond a doubt. The other families were too scared to give me their originals, or their paperwork was sloppy. But this James Sterling's deed is an ironclad fact." Tucker tapped the Sterling document. "If we take this directly to Judge Augustus Morrison in Helena, we can bypass the county entirely. Morrison is a federal circuit judge. He don't take Thorne as coin, and he don't fear his name. He can issue an emergency territorial injunction, suspend every claim Thorne has filed, and send the federal marshals down here to clean out Dawes' office." Gideon stood up, pulling his hat back down over his brow. "Then we don't waste another hour. Pack your ledger. Tucker, we ride for Helena." "I can't leave today," Tucker said, his face tightening. "If I walk out of this office with a saddlebag full of files, Peters will telegraph his uncle before I clear the town limits. He has to think it is just another Tuesday. I need 48 hours to finalize the briefs and smuggle the records out of the building after dark." "You don't have 48 hours, Gideon said, his voice dropping into that quiet, absolute danger zone. "Thorne sent riders to the Sterling cabin last night. They know someone is standing on that porch the minute those boys report back. Thorne's going to realize his window is closing. He'll move fast." Gideon reached down and picked up the Sterling documents, sliding them back into his duster pocket. "I am taking these with me. I am riding to Helena alone, right now. I'll put the deed in front of Morrison myself. You fire Peters before the sun goes down. File your briefs, and follow me when the road is clear." Tucker looked at Gideon's dark, unyielding face. He stood up and extended his hand across the desk. "You said you used to wear a badge." "Vance, former," Gideon said, his grip tight and hard. "A title don't make a lawman." "Gideon," Tucker said softly, looking him dead in the eye. The willingness to carry the weight of other people's justice when they re too weak to lift it themselves, that's what makes the badge. Safe travels. Gideon walked out through the front office without looking at Peters, who was just returning with a tray of tin coffee cups. He unhitched Ranger, swung up into the saddle, and pointed the stallion's head toward the northern mountain trail. The sky was turning a hard, brilliant blue, and the wind was rising from the canyons. Gideon dug his spurs into the buckskin's flanks, breaking into a gallop. He had a day and a half of hard riding ahead of him, and a territory to save from its own lies. The mountain trail didn't offer any shortcuts. It was a jagged ribbon of gray rock and loose shale, twisting upward through the pine-choked canyons of the Big Belt Range. The air grew thinner with every mile, losing the thick, dusty heat of the flats and taking on the sharp, pine-scented chill of the high peaks. Gideon Vance didn't spare the buckskin. He didn't abuse him either. A man who knows horses understands that a beast heart is the only thing standing between him and a lonely grave on a mountain ledge. You listen to the breath. You measure the stride. Ranger's chest heaved, his nostrils flaring wide as he dug his iron shoes into the steep incline. Gideon leaned forward in the saddle, shifting his weight to help the horse climb. "Steady, boy," Gideon murmured, his hand patting the wet leather of the stallion's neck. "Just a bit more ridge. Then we drop into the valley." They cleared the timber line around dusk of the first day. The sun was dipping behind the western peaks, bleeding a deep, angry crimson across the Montana sky. The wind hit them hard up there. It was a howling, freezing force that traveled straight from the northern snowfields without hitting a single tree to slow it down. Gideon pulled his duster tight around his ribs, his eyes scanning the rocky trail ahead. Suddenly, Ranger's ears snapped forward. The stallion didn't stop, but his stride went rigid. Gideon's hand dropped to the Winchester scabbard. He didn't look back. He didn't change his pace. He just watched the gray rocks on his left, where the canyon wall rose steep against the sky. Through the gathering shadows, he caught the movement. Two shapes, two horses, walking slow along the upper rim, tracking his parallel line. Thorn scouts. They hadn't tried to cut the trail. They weren't closing the distance for a gunfight. They were just staying at the edge of the rim, letting him know they were there. It was the same old game, intimidation. They wanted him to look over his shoulder. They wanted his hand to shake on the reins. Gideon didn't give them the satisfaction. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead on the northern pass. A man who's running on a lie has to keep watching his back. "Ranger," Gideon said aloud, his voice swallowed instantly by the roaring wind. "The truth don't need to look behind it. It just keeps walking." He pushed the stallion through the night, camping fast and cold in a deep draws where the firelight wouldn't show against the dark timber. He didn't unbutton his duster. He slept with his back against a pine root, his fingers looped through the trigger guard of his rifle, counting the hours by the stars shifting through the pine needles. By mid-afternoon of the second day, the timber gave way to the sprawling, chaotic valley of Helena. The territorial capital was a loud, ugly scar of a town, built on gold dust, mud, and timber smoke. It didn't look like Oak Haven. It had brick buildings, telegraph lines humming over the rooftops, and hundreds of men in black coats and muddy boots crowding the wooden sidewalks. It was the place where the wilderness met the inkwell. Gideon tied a lathered, exhausted Ranger to the hitching rail outside the territorial courthouse. The building was a massive stone structure, with white pillars that looked like they belonged in Washington rather than the mountains. Gideon didn't stop to brush the gray mountain dust off his duster. He walked straight through the heavy oak doors, his iron spurs clinking loud against the marble floor of the grand hallway. A young clerk in a black silk vest intercepted him outside the judge's chambers. He looked at Gideon's muddy boots, his trail-stained shirt, and the hard, dark beard with an expression of immediate disgust. "You can't go in there, sir," the clerk said, holding up a manicured hand. "Judge Morrison is in chambers preparing his fall docket. You need an appointment." Gideon didn't stop walking. He didn't raise his voice. He just reached into his duster pocket, pulled out the silk-wrapped sterling deed, and dropped it square onto the clerk's neat stack of ledger papers. "Tell the judge that a former Deputy United States Marshal from the Billings District is standing in his hallway," Gideon said, his voice dropping into that quiet, gravelly weight that made the young clerk's hand drop. "Tell him I've got documented land fraud affecting 7 homesteading families in the Southern Valley, and I need 15 minutes of his time before Barrett Thorne uses a match to rewrite the county books." The clerk looked at the silk wrapper, then up at Gideon's unblinking gray eyes. He swallowed hard, turned on his heel, and disappeared through the heavy inner door. 2 minutes later, the door opened wide. "Judge Morrison will see you, Mr. Vance." The inner office smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and expensive tobacco. Judge Augustus Morrison sat behind a massive oak desk littered with legal briefs. He was a large man in his late 60s, with a mane of thick white hair and a face that looked like it had been chiseled out of a mountain ledge. He didn't wear a robe in chambers, just a black waistcoat and a white linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked at Gideon through a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, his eyes sharp and completely clear of the political fog that clogged the county seats. "Gideon Vance," the judge said, his voice a deep, resonant boom. "I haven't seen your name on a marshal's ledger since '72. I thought you'd gone to seed in the southern hills." "I was riding, Judge," Gideon said, sitting down in the leather chair without being asked, "but I found a place worth stopping for." Gideon reached over and slid the sterling documents across the desk. Next to them, he placed the legal folio that Lawyer Tucker had smuggled out of Oakhaven. Morrison didn't make a speech. He picked up the sterling deed, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. He was a practiced reader. His eyes moved with a frightening, silent speed across the ink lines, tracking the dates, the registration numbers, the official seals. He read the whole packet twice, then flipped open Tucker's folio, scanning the names of the Hesters, the Brennans, the descriptions of the fraudulent debt notes. The silence in the room lasted 10 minutes. The only sound was the steady ticking of a brass grandfather clock in the corner, and the occasional scrape of Morrison's fingernail against the parchment. Finally, the judge set the papers down. He took off his spectacles and looked at Gideon, his thick white eyebrows drawing together. "This deed is immaculate, Vance," Morrison said. "James Sterling filed this grant under the '62 Homestead Act. It's entered in the Helena Ledger under Volume 4, page 92. There is no debt. There never was." "I know," Gideon said, "but Barrett Thorne's got a paper that says otherwise. He has got 2 witnesses who swear James signed a note 3 months before he died." Morrison let out a short, harsh bark that sounded like a laugh but wasn't. He reached into his drawer, pulled out a thick county death directory, and flipped through the pages. He cross-referenced 2 names from Thorne's witness list against the ledger. "The 2 witnesses on Thorne's promissory note," Morrison said, his finger tapping the directory with a heavy thud. "Silas Finch and Marcus Vance. They died of the smallpox in the winter of '73. Gideon, the date on Thorne's note is May of '74. He's got dead men signing contracts in his kitchen." Gideon leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees. "That's the twist, Judge." He didn't think anyone would look at the Helena death books. He figured a Goafu and an 8-year-old girl wouldn't know how to ask the question. He built his whole empire on the bet that people would be too terrified of his muscle to look at the date on the paper. Morrison stood up, his tall frame pacing over to the window that looked out at the bustling city. "It's a sickness, Vance. This territory was built by people who broke the sod with their bare hands, who buried their children in the blizzard, who poured their lives into making something out of nothing. The law exists to protect that labor. It sent the fence line of our civilization. When a man like Thorne uses a fraudulent seal to steal a woman's roof, he isn't just stealing dirt, he's ripping the foundation out from under the whole territory." The judge walked back to his desk, caught up a steel-nibbed pen, and dipped it into the inkwell. "I am issuing an emergency territorial injunction," Morrison said, his pen scratching furious against a fresh sheet of parchment. "Every claim filed under the name of Barrett Thorne in the Southern Valley is suspended effective immediately. I'm ordering a full forensic audit of his business records, and I am sending a certified copy of this warrant to the Territorial Marshal S office. They have 5 deputies in Oakhaven before the week is out to relieve Sheriff Dawes of his keys. He slammed his heavy iron seal down onto the hot red wax at the bottom of the page. Morrison handed the certified copy to Gideon. Take this back to Oakhaven, Vance. Put it in Samuel Tucker's hands. Tell the other families to get their wagons ready. They're recoming to Helena next week to testify. And I want every single one of them standing in my courtroom when I dismantle Barrett Thornton's house brick by brick. Gideon took the parchment, the paper still warm from the wax. He stood up, his back straight, the trail weariness suddenly lifting from his shoulders. Thank you, Judge, Gideon said. Don't thank me, Gideon, Morrison said, looking at him over his glasses. Thank that little girl who had the courage to stop a stranger on the road. The law only works when someone's brave enough to call for it. Now get out of here. You've got a long ride back. The ride back to the valley was a blur of dust and pounding hooves. Gideon pushed Ranger through the pass, the certified injunction flat against his chest under his leather vest. He didn't look at the ridges for scouts. He didn't care if they were watching. He had the law of the United States territory in his pocket, and that paper weighed more than every rifle Barrett Thorne could buy. He rode into the Sterling yard on the afternoon of the 3rd day. What he found left him motionless in the saddle. There weren't 4 midnight riders with torches. There were 3 heavy farm wagons parked in the dirt. Ed Calder was standing by the porch, his hat in his hands, talking to Clara Sterling. Clara was sitting in the wooden chair, her color completely back, a blue woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders. In the second wagon sat the Hester family, the old rancher, his wife and his 2 grown sons. In the third were the Brennans, their children sitting quiet on the hay sacks. They weren't hiding anymore. They'd come out into the light. Ruthie was sitting on her favorite fence post, her bare feet swinging, her eyes tracking Gideon as Ranger cleared the cottonwoods. She didn't shout. She just nodded once. That steady, serious gesture that told him she'd been waiting for him exactly where she'd promised. Gideon dismounted, his legs stiff from 36 hours in the leather. He walked straight to the porch, pulled the parchment from his vest, and handed it to Clara. Judge Morrison signed it, Gideon said, his voice carrying through the quiet yard. It's an emergency injunction. Every claim Thorne has against this valley is frozen. His witness signatures are frauds. He used the names of men who have been in the graveyard since '73. The Territorial Marshal is coming down next week to take Dawes' badge. A collective gasp went through the wagons. Old Man Hester stepped down from his seat, his hand shaking as he reached out to touch the edge of the parchment in Clara's hands. Is it real? Mr. Hester asked, his voice cracked with years of silent worry. Can we keep the creek pasture? It's legal and binding, Gideon said, turning to face the assembled families. Every single one of you is named in the folio. You aren't fighting Thorne alone in a dark kitchen anymore. Next Tuesday, we re-all riding to Helena. We re-standing in a federal court, and we retelling Judge Morrison exactly what Thorne riders did to your fences and your livestock. The law is our wall now, folks, and it's a wall Thorne can't climb. Ed Calder stepped forward, his weathered face split by a wide, honest grin. I told him, Vance, when the riders came back through the valley after you left, I went down to Hester's place. I told him what you said about the grave. We figured if a stranger is willing to ride 70 miles for a goafoo he don't know, the least we could do is hitch the teams and stand together. Clara stood up from her chair. She didn't look like a sick woman anymore. She stood tall, her green eyes shining with a fierce, beautiful light as she looked at her neighbors, then at Gideon. We made choices, Mr. Vance, Clara said, her voice clear and strong, and we made different choices today. This territory don't belong to the man with the biggest bank ledger. It belongs to the people who put their lives into the soil. She walked over to Gideon, her hand reaching out to touch his sleeve. Thank you for not riding past. Gideon, I was done running. Clara, Gideon said softly, his hand covering hers for a brief second. A man don't find his dignity on the road. He finds it when he stops and helps his fellow man build something that lasts. The next morning, lawyer Samuel Tucker arrived from town. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were bright behind his spectacles. He'd been fired Peters 2 minutes after Gideon had ridden out of Oak Haven, and the young clerk had packed his bags and fled the county before dark. Thorne had realized his network was shattered. He hadn't even attempted to send his riders back to the valley. Tucker sat at the wooden table outside on the grass, going through the papers with the families one by one, organizing the testimonies for the Helena hearing. Gideon sat on the porch steps, watching the community assemble itself in the sun. Ruthie hopped off her fence post and walked over, sitting down beside him on the dry timber. She had a piece of salt beef in her fingers, sharing a corner of it with the gray cat. Gideon, she said, catching herself. Are we going to win next week? Yes. Knock, Gideon said, his arm resting easy over his knee. We're going to win. Thorne's going to a federal prison, and your mama's going to have that deed clean for the rest of her days. And you, she asked, her serious green eyes looking up into his face, are you going back to the road? Gideon looked out across the yard. He looked at Ed Calder, who was currently helping old man Hester grease his wagon wheels. He looked at Clara, who was laughing with Mrs. Hester by the pump. He looked at the vast, beautiful northern prairie, stretching out toward the mountains, a land that was no longer empty, but filled with the voices of people who had discovered that standing together was the only way to stay free. He reached down and pulled his Stetson low, a quiet warmth settling deep into his chest where the cold ghost of his past used to live. I've been looking at that north pasture, Ruthie, Gideon said, his voice dropping into that rhythmic, comfortable cadence. It's been sitting unused for 2 years. Your daddy always meant to put cattle on it, but he ran out of time. Ruthie stopped chewing, her face turning perfectly still. You know about cattle. I know 'em well enough, Gideon said, a small smile breaking through his dark beard. And I reckon your mama's going to need someone who knows how to drive a fence post straight when the winter storms hit. A home ain't something you're born into. Knock, it's a place you choose with your whole heart, on purpose. I think I done choosing the trail. Ruthie didn't make a speech. She didn't shout for her mother. She just reached out her small, dirt-stained hand and wrapped her fingers tight around Gideon's thumb, squeezing it once with all the strength her 8-year-old body could muster. Gideon looked at her small, healed feet, then out at the bright Montana sun clearing the peaks. Rebecca had been right all those years ago. He was a useful man when he wanted to be. And looking at the valley below, he knew this was the first day of a long road worth taking. The road back from Helena was different. The dust was the same. Yes, the heat still rose off the flats in wavy, shimmering sheets, but the air felt lighter in a man's lungs. Gideon Vance let Ranger set the pace. The buckskin stallion held his head high, his ears flicking back toward the wagons rolling behind them. There were 7 wagons in total now. 7 families who had walked into a stone courthouse with their heads down and walked out with their shoulders squared. Barrett Thorne's carriage had passed them on the first day out of the Capitol. He wasn't looking at the ridges anymore. He sat in the back of that shiny black buckboard, his expensive city lawyers whispering in his ears, his face the color of old lard. The territorial Marshal S-men were already sitting in Oak Haven, sorting through his iron filing boxes. Within the month, Thorne would be looking at an iron cell. Within the year, his name wouldn't mean power or fear anymore. It would just be a lesson folks taught their kids about what happens when you try to build a life on the broken rights of your neighbors. Gideon pulled up at the boundary line of the Sterling property just as the sun started to paint the timber gold. The north pasture stretched out toward the base of the mountains. It was a wide, rolling sea of bunchgrass, dry and yellowed by the August sun, but deep enough to hide a calf. It had been sitting silent for 2 years, empty dirt, a monument to everything James Sterling had run out of time to finish. Clara Sterling brought her team to a halt beside Gideon S. horse. She handed the leather reins to Ruthie, who took them with the calm efficiency of an old teamster, and stepped down from the wagon seat. Her boots hit the soil with a soft, confident thud. It looks big today. Gideon, Clara said, Walking over to stand by Ranger's stirrup, she looked out at the rolling grass, her green eyes reflecting the golden light of the hills. "It's as good dirt, Clara," Gideon said, sliding down from his saddle. He didn't drop his hat this time. He kept it on, looking her straight in the eye. "It's got the creek running through the bottom draw, and the shelter of the pines when the north wind starts to spit snow. A man can raise a healthy herd on this grass if he knows how to keep the lines straight." The other wagons had stopped along the trail. Ed Calder climbed down from his seat, walking over with his heavy, rolling stride. He looked at the sagging fence line that ran up the ridge, then at Gideon. "We got 3 days before the threshing starts." "Vance," Calder said, wiping his brow with a blue bandana. "The Hesters brought their post auger. The Brennans got a spool of fresh galvanized wire they bought in town. We figured we might as well run this line all the way to the timber before we hit our own chores." Gideon looked back at the wagons. Old Man Hester was already lifting a heavy iron bar from his wagon bed. The Brennan boys were unloading a cedar post, their voices lifting in a light, easy laugh that hadn't been heard in this valley for a long time. "You don't owe us this," Ed, Gideon said softly. "Nobody's talking about debts, Gideon," Calder said, his voice dropping into that deep, honest register. He looked at Clara, then back at the cowboy. "We spent 2 years pretending we didn't see what was happening to the folks around us because we thought it kept our own roofs safe. We were wrong. A man who won't help his neighbor build a fence don't deserve to have a boundary line of his own. We just putting the foundation back where it belongs." Gideon nodded once. "Let's get the auger." Then they worked until the stars came out. The sound of the iron bar hitting the stony soil rhythmically broke the evening silence. Thud, thud, clink. Every family took a turn. The men dug the holes, their muscles bunching under their sweat-stained shirts. The women carried the water buckets, keeping the dirt damp so the tools could bite deep. Ruthie and the Hester children carried the iron staples, dropping them into the wooden boxes by each post with a steady, metallic patter. Gideon watched Clara handle the wire pliers. She didn't ask for help. She stood by the corner post, her feet planted wide in the dirt, bracing her shoulder against the timber as she pulled the line taut. Her hands were calloused now, the skin rough from the trail and the courtroom, but they were steady. Gideon walked over and took the tail of the wire to help her hold the tension. "You've got a good eye for a brace, Mrs. Sterling," Gideon muttered, watching her twist the iron with a quick, decisive turn of her wrist. "I had a good teacher, Mr. Vance," she said, not looking up from her knot. "James always said that a house is only as strong as the people inside it, but a ranch is only as honest as the fence that keeps the world out. If the wire sags, the whole thing is just an invitation for trouble." She clipped the wire with a sharp snap. "He was right," Gideon said, stepping back to admire the line. It was straight as an arrow, the 3 strands of silver wire catching the first light of the rising moon. "But a fence don't just keep things out, Clara, it holds things in. It defines the place where you choose to stop running and start investing your life. It's the visual marker of a commitment." Clara stood up, her breath coming even and slow in the cool night air. She looked at his dark face, her green eyes dark and unreadable in the silver light. "And you, Gideon, have you found your marker?" Gideon looked out at the dark silhouette of the mountain pass. For 7 long years, he'd been looking at that horizon through the ears of a horse, thinking that freedom was a matter of miles. He'd have thought that by refusing to love anyone, by refusing to carry any man's burden, he was keeping his own soul safe from the winter. But looking at the campfire that had been lit down by the cabin, looking at the families sitting on the grass sharing mo bang mi and coffee, he knew the truth. He'd have just been a ghost riding a buckskin horse. "I am done with the road, Clara," Gideon said, his voice dropping into that low, resonant register that sounded like stones shifting in a deep river. "A man who spends his whole life moving don't leave nothing behind but dust. I want to see this grass turn green in the spring. I want to see that little girl grow up without having to walk 12 miles in the dirt just to find an honest man." He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were warm, rough, and completely real. I reckon I know cattle well enough to stock this draw, Gideon said. If you're still looking for a partner who don't mind a hard winter. Clara didn't pull her hand away. Her fingers tightened around his palm. A strong, binding grip that felt exactly like a covenant made in front of a judge. I've been looking for an honest man for 2 years. Gideon, she said softly, her chin lifting in that proud, beautiful way she had. The north pasture is yours. Welcome home. Ruthie appeared from the shadow of the wagon, the gray cat tucked under her arm like a sack of flour. She stopped 3 feet away, her serious green eyes looking from Gideon to her mother, then down at their joined hands. She didn't smile. She didn't make a fuss. She just nodded once. That short, sharp gesture that settled everything. The cornmeal's boiling. Gideon, the girl said, her voice clear in the quiet night. Mama made it with the fresh butter, Mrs. Calder brought. You better come eat before the wind turns it cold. We coming. Knock, Gideon said, releasing Clara's hand and reaching down to pick up his iron pliers. They walked down the hill together, the 3 of them, their boots making a steady, unified cadence in the dark grass. The firelight from the cabin yard threw long, warm shadows ahead of them, reaching out to welcome them back to the timber. Gideon Vance looked at the solid logs of the cabin, at the straight fence line on the ridge, and at the brave little girl walking ahead of him. He thought about Rebecca, who had told him on the coldest night he could remember that a man who don't stand for something ends up falling for nothing. He thought she would have liked this valley. He thought she would have respected the Goafu who held her shotgun on a dark porch, and the little girl who stopped a stranger with nothing but her own small chest. He picked up his hat, set it straight on his head, and walked through the door. The latch clicked shut behind him, an iron sound that carried no doubt, no hesitation, and no more lies. The road was gone, the pasture was waiting, and the first day of his new life was just beginning.
This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work. In the end, this story is not only about a lonely cowboy, a threatened widow, or a little girl brave enough to stand in the middle of a dusty road. It is about the moment when a human heart decides it can no longer ride past suffering, and call that freedom. Gideon Vance began this journey as a man who had buried more than his wife. He had buried his purpose, his faith in people, and the part of himself that once believed justice was worth fighting for. For 7 years, he told himself that staying out of other people's troubles was the safest way to survive. But safety without meaning is not truly living. It is only a quieter kind of death. And when Ruthie Sterling stood before him with bleeding feet and desperate eyes, she reminded him of a truth he had tried to forget. Sometimes the door that is not yours to walk through is exactly the door God places in front of you. The lesson of Gideon's story is that courage does not always arrive with a badge, a title, or a grand speech. Sometimes courage looks like an 8-year-old child walking 12 miles, because love gives her no other choice. Sometimes it looks like a sick mother stepping onto her own porch with trembling strength and refusing to surrender the home her husband died protecting. Sometimes it looks like a broken man choosing to stop running, not because the road has ended, but because he has finally found something worth standing for. True courage is not the absence of fear. Clara was afraid. Ruthie was afraid. Even Gideon, in his own quiet way, carried the fear of losing again. But courage begins when what we love becomes greater than what we fear. This story also reminds us that injustice grows strongest in silence. Barrett Thorne did not build his power only through forged papers and hired guns. He built it through the fear of decent people who looked away. Every closed door, every neighbor who said, "It is not my concern," every official who valued comfort over duty, became another plank in Thorne's empire. That is one of the hardest truths in this tale. Evil often succeeds not because there are too many villains, but because too many good people convince themselves that staying neutral is the same as staying safe. But the moment Ed Calder and the other families chose to stand together, the balance changed. A bully can threaten one house in the dark. He cannot easily burn down a whole valley standing in the light. At its heart, this is a story about community. The fence line in the Sterling pasture is more than wood, wire, and iron staples. It is a symbol of dignity, belonging, and shared responsibility. A fence marks what a family has built, what they are willing to protect, and where they choose to plant their future. But by the end of the story, that fence becomes something even larger. It becomes proof that a home is never truly safe when a neighbor's home is under threat. Freedom is not preserved by isolation. It is preserved when ordinary people decide that another person's rights matter as much as their own. When one widow keeps her land, every honest family in the valley stands a little taller. And perhaps the most meaningful transformation belongs to Gideon himself. He believed grief had made him useless. He thought the best he could do was keep moving, keep his distance, and leave no one close enough to lose. But Ruthie and Clara showed him that the wounded heart can still be a shelter for someone else. A man does not heal by pretending he has no scars. He heals when he allows those scars to become wisdom, protection, and compassion. Gideon did not find peace by outrunning his past. He found it by using the strength his past had given him to defend people who needed him. In helping Clara and Ruthie save their home, he found his own. So the value of this story is simple, but powerful. Never underestimate the good that begins when one person chooses not to look away. One act of kindness can become a stand for justice. One brave child can awaken a sleeping conscience. One honest man can remind a frightened community who they were meant to be.